And this is in preparation for Opera Lafayette's festival dedicated to the musical patronage of Madame de Pompadour. If you've joined us for some of these previous salons, we've focused thus far on the Pompadour's time at court, some aggressive, as well as looking at the general musical context of her operatic innovations. And this evening, what we're going to be doing is taking inspiration from the broader artistic atmosphere of Pompadour's Versailles. And we're beginning to think about the resonances of the Rococo style in the arts that existed then and that might linger today. And we have a real treat this evening in that joining us are three eminent art historians who I'm going to introduce just briefly before putting their full bios in the chat. And as usual, as we proceed, do feel free to put questions into the chat, and then I'll compile them and have them ready for our speakers. They're going to leave ample time to discuss those questions at the end. So joining us this evening, we have Melissa Hyde, who's professor and distinguished teaching scholar at the University of Florida. Her scholarly interests include women artists, and more broadly, the gendering of aesthetic culture, the cultural meanings of color, self-portraiture, questions of identity, and afterlives of the Rococo. And she has key publications, including Making Up the Rococo, Francois Boucher and His Critics, and Rethinking Boucher, which in fact she co-edited with one of our other speakers here, Mark Ledbury. Mark Ledbury is Power Professor of Art History and Director of the Power Institute at the University of Sydney. So thank you for zooming in from across the globe. His research focuses on the relationships between theater and visual art and on the concept of genre in the visual arts. And he's the author of a number of wonderful books, studies on Francois Boucher, Jean-Baptiste Greuze, and Jacques-Louis David, among others. And finally, closer to home, we have Meredith Martin, who's Associate Professor of Art History at NYU and the Institute of Fine Arts. She's a specialist in early modern French art, architecture, and cross-cultural exchange. And she's recently co-authored with Gillian Weiss the award-winning book, The Sun King at Sea, Maritime Art and Gallery Slavery in Louis XIV's France. She's also the author of one of my favorite titled books of all time, Dairy Queens, The Politics of Pastoral Architecture, from Catherine de Medici to Marie Antoinette. Again, I'll put those full bios into the chat so you can peruse them, but I want to hand it off to our speakers now. Thanks so much. Looking forward.
Thank you, Julia. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us this evening. It is such a pleasure for the three of us to have this opportunity to talk about Pompadour and this period of the 18th century whose art and music we love so much that we've made a profession of talking and writing about it. And we want to thank also Ryan for inviting us to participate in the Salon series, and to Jace for all of her indispensable work in making it happen. Just a word about the format. We plan for each of us to briefly introduce specific works of art or material culture that speak to some of the key themes we'd like to share with you. And we may be chiming in where we see fit as we go along. And then we will like to open things up for questions that you might have at in the last part. So Meredith is managing the slides. So if we could go to the next slide. Great, thank you. So the Art Museum at my university, University of Florida, recently acquired a print of this photograph that you see on your left by the Haitian-American artist Fabiola Jean-Louis, entitled Marie Antoinette is Dead. And it's part of a series of her photographs called Rewriting History. And I was very interested in it for the way that it engages critically with the Rococo. And this is something Mark and I talk a bit about in our essay for the opera that's coming up. I took one of my classes to see the work, and some of my students are here, so they'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Being good students of 18th century art, they immediately noticed that the painting that Fabiola Jean-Louis evokes in her photograph is a portrait by Francois Boucher, who you see of 1756, which does not depict Marie Antoinette, but Madame de Pompadour. And so there were questions about that and the reasons why she might have made that choice. And I think she might have chosen that title for many reasons, but whatever her reasons, the title Marie Antoinette is Dead capitalizes on the fact that Marie supposedly let them eat cake. Antoinette, ill-fated queen of France, has greater name recognition nowadays than Pompadour, as one of the Rococo queens, as one of our colleagues has dubbed them some time ago. So I thought that we could just start by talking a little bit about who was Madame de Pompadour. Many of you here will already know this, especially if you attended the excellent lecture on Pompadour given last fall in the Salon series by Christine Adams, which I enjoyed immensely. Got to watch it on YouTube. Pompadour was the acknowledged mistress of Louis XV and one of the most influential and high-profile patrons of Rococo art of her time. So she was non-noble birth, but very well connected to financial elites in 18th century Paris. And in 1745, when she became the favorite of Louis XV, he granted her the title of ennoblement, so that the woman who was born Jean Fish, as we would say in English, Jeanne Poisson, became Madame la Marquise de Pompadour. And after some years as the king's favorite, the king appointed Pompadour as a lady-in-waiting to Louis's queen, Marie Leszczyńska. She must have been thrilled, I'm sure, as if it made it seem like she sanctioned Pompadour's presence at court. And it's generally thought that and I'm talking about the portrait on the right, that this magnificent portrait of Pompadour was painted to mark the occasion. And it shows her luxuriating in this sumptuous cabinet or boudoir, apparently in a moment of thought or reverie. And she's surrounded by the various accoutrements that attested to her talents as an artist and to her pastimes as a reader and letter writer. She's presented very much as the queen of her domain. And she wears this spectacular gown of teal blue-green silk adorned with lace sleeves, artificial pink roses, this ladder of bows that runs up the front of the dress. And then she has a real corsage of flowers up at the upper, part of her décolletage. So the portrait, actually, Meredith, can we go to the next one? So the portrait was exhibited publicly at the famous Salon exhibition of paintings that took place at the Louvre every 2 years. This was in 1757. And in some sense, I think the exhibition of the painting itself in this public way was a kind of act of defiance, because it so conspicuously announced her presence and status at court. But beyond that, as you can see in the image on the left, it was very ceremoniously exhibited on its own dais at the Salon. And this was a kind of honor that was normally accorded only to portraits of the royal family. So this is a very conspicuous kind of statement about her status and position at court. So Pompadour's role as royal mistress meant that she wielded a great deal of influence at court. And this was because she was so close to the king. She was able to secure courtly favors from him and be involved with political decisions, allegedly anyway. Her critics claimed that she in turn had too much influence over the king, and she's been described, she was at the time even, as a kind of de facto prime minister. This, I think, is a great exaggeration. Nonetheless, that's kind of the legend of Pompadour. So contemporary accounts of her life at court talk quite a lot about how courtiers who wished to secure Pompadour's favor or that of the king would line up to visit her in her private apartments while she was at her dressing table. And if we could go to the next slide, at her dressing table, performing her morning toilette. And I kind of place an underscore on performing the toilette. That is, she would be seen, be visited by ambassadors and courtiers and so forth, and the act of applying powder, her hair powder, her makeup, especially rouge, for which she was kind of famous and apparently extremely fond. So we're seeing her in this portrait on the left that's in the Fogg Museum, which is a work that's been much written about now, painted shortly, actually, in very short succession from after the painting in the blue dress that we were just looking at a moment ago. Quite idealizes her, but it is a kind of virtuoso study in pink and white, quintessentially Rococo colors in terms of the palette. She's wearing a cameo of the king's profile on her wrist in case there's any doubt about what her connection is to royalty. And this painting's quite different from the other one I was showing you in a number of ways, and not least of all because it was a private painting in the sense it was never exhibited at the Salon, but it was nonetheless displayed in one of her residences so that courtiers would see it, and its message about her status would not have been lost on them. I just want to come back to a second to the idea of performing, though. I refer to her as performing her toilette because that's very much what we're presented with here. She's really, in fact, shown at her second ritual toilette. This is not what she would have looked like when she got out of bed in the morning, right? She appears here in the painting already made up, powdered, ready for prime time, as it were, you know, to entertain her supplicants, as one might say, people who've come to pay homage to her. The painting has been widely written about, as I said, by art historians because of the way it encapsulates and really thematizes some of the key elements of Rococo art in general and the ideals of female beauty in particular. And I'm talking especially about the kind of unapologetic love of artifice in the form of cosmetic enhancements that you see in the painting. She's in the process of applying her rouge that she's dipped in the rouge box in her hand. And another key theme here, I think, is the idea that the arts of appearing are essential to the definition of one's identity, personal identity, class identity, that these aspects of self and of identity are largely a matter of performing. So with that said, I am going to hand things over to Meredith, who's going to talk about the toilette table and Pompadour's toilette and other things. So I don't know, do you have anything you two would like to add at this point? I don't know if I'm kind of rushing through because I want to make sure we all have time, but if there's anything you want to add, please jump in.
Well, I just want to say quickly, you know, you have been one of the foremost sort of experts on unpacking this painting for readers. And I love what you say about the kind of interplay between makeup, you know, cosmetics and the artifice of the Rococo in a both a kind of positive and a sort of pejorative sense in terms of the reception. I don't know if you want to say just a little bit about that. You don't have to.
Well, maybe let's circle back to it if we have time, because I just want to make sure that you guys both have a chance to talk. But yes, that's a really key, you know, key theme here as well, which I'd be happy to talk more about. But okay. Thank you for the nod. Yes, this is one of my, you know, beloved paintings, and we'll pay homage to it whenever we can.
All right, so I'll pick up the baton, and I want to just talk a little bit about Pompadour. You know, we've looked at a couple of portraits by Boucher that represent Pompadour, and I want to talk about her as a kind of multimedia patron of the arts, and one who had a whole variety of kind of furnishings, decorative arts, you know, props, as it were, in which to carry out these performances, you know, in the kind of sphere of everyday life. So not just on the stage. And that's a kind of, you know, extended metaphor that we're all going to be talking about. Mark's going to speak specifically about, you know, her deep engagement with music and opera and theater and, you know, that kind of performance. But we're talking about performance in a kind of expanded field. And I wanted to turn your attention to this wonderful table, which is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which would be the kind of table in which Pompadour could kind of perform her toilette or sort of other activities that she was engaged with, both in the sort of semi-private spaces of the cabinet or the boudoir, like the one that she appears in Boucher's painting. But, you know, nothing was ever really private at court, and the toilette was a kind of public performance, you know, as Melissa mentioned, in terms of ambassadors and courtiers coming to watch her do this kind of performance. And this type of table really facilitated that in a number of different ways. So this was made by one of her cabinet makers, Jean-François Aubin, and it's done in a kind of high Rococo style. You can see these organic serpentine lines and the legs, and it also has a kind of anthropomorphic quality, which is characteristic of a lot of Rococo furniture, almost as if it looks like it's going to kind of, you know, get up and walk out of the room. And, you know, this was a culture that was kind of obsessed with the boundary between sort of persons and things, or animate and inanimate form. And it makes sense because it's a culture in which sort of consumption becomes really paramount, really key to demonstrating and performing one's nobility. And so it's a world in which objects come not just to express the self, but in some ways maybe even to replace the self. And there's a whole genre of literature that emerges in this period, the so-called it narratives, in which objects come to life and they kind of tell their stories. One of the most famous one is called Le Sofa, which is the story basically of a couch, a sofa, that narrates its sitter's sexual exploits. You know, this is also a very kind of libertine culture at the time. But you can also see that this table is done with, you know, a great deal of skill, you know, by numerous craftsmen. So Evan might have sort of directed the production, but you would have craftsmen who would put on the gilt bronze mounts, who would do this kind of expert carved marquetry. You can see this incredible sort of piecework in the legs. And then it's a little bit hard to see the marquetry itself, but it would have been done with a variety of different woods, primarily oak, but also veneered with exotic hardwoods, including mahogany, which would have been harvested in most likely in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, or Haiti, as Saint-Domingue was known prior to the revolution and the Haitian independence in 1804. It's the French colony, and it's possible that the artist Fabiola Jean-Louis is interested in the kind of colonial origins of much Rococo art, and is maybe sort of engaging with this time period as a way to perhaps think about the ways in which some of the enslaved laborers who would have been responsible for harvesting this mahogany are kind of written out of history, or they're invisible, but they are present through in other ways, through the materials of these kinds of objects. Just to show you a few details of this, wait, let me see if I can, just to advance. You can see it, a similar kind of Rococo furniture, a little table with a quill and ink and a letter, a kind of wax seal and a candlestick, and the detail of the Boucher portrait that Melissa showed you that you see here at the top left. And then in terms of some elements of the mechanical table itself, I'll just point out a few details. First of all, you can't see this very well, but at the very top of the gilt bronze mounts, at the top of each leg, there's a tiny little, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can you see me pointing to this area? Okay, there's a little tower, which was the kind of central sort of motif of Pompadour's coat of arms. And then on the tabletop here with the vase, you can see a little ducal coronet. These are sort of elements, iconography that expresses her nobility. And as Melissa mentioned, she was not born into the nobility. When she became the official maîtresse en titre, there was a sort of title a marquisate purchased for her. And this was a lot of courtiers, especially old guard, feudal, noble courtiers, found it kind of shocking that this parvenu, this sort of arriviste, arrived at this very high title. And so part of her need to kind of constantly represent and to sort of perform her elite status, had to do with her own origins. So you can see it expressed in iconography, but also through the way that she would have interacted with this kind of, mechanical table. And what does that mean, mechanical table? So I'm going to make a few points which actually have been developed in a really wonderful essay, kind of classic essay that I always assign to my students, and I'm happy to send around to anyone who might want to read it. It's by another 18th century French specialist named Mimi Hellman, and it's called The Work of Leisure, Furniture, Sociability, and Elite something in 18th century France. But this phrase work of leisure is the idea that this may seem like a kind of, very sort of decadent society where everyone's just engaged in a sort of, frivolous pursuit of leisure and pleasure. That's the kind of stereotype of the Rococo that was actually being, propounded in the 18th century by moralizing critics. And I think this was a culture that took leisure and pleasure quite seriously. For which it was a kind of, really important matter of sort of social and political expression. But it did involve a fair amount of work in the sense that, try to imagine what it would be like to sit, with the elaborate gowns, the huge hoop skirts, that Madame de Pompadour and other noble women are wearing, to kind of sit elegantly at one of these small tables, and then to kind of perform this ritual with the aid of this table in which you'd have different elements with sort of secret locks. There's a little, you can see this is not so secret, but you can see a little keyhole here with a key that Madame de Pompadour herself would have, kept with her, but also even little small secret buttons that one would have to know how to kind of manipulate and pop. And then the tabletop would push back, a drawer would slide open. You'd have a kind of multifunctional table that could lift up, that you could put a book on, or maybe with another button you could push it and it would flip, and you'd have a mirror and you could sort of do your toilette. And you had to know how to operate these very complicated pieces of furniture. And sometimes cabinet makers like Aubin would have to come to court and show the new owners of these furnishings, how to do this. But there's always this kind of risk that maybe you wouldn't remember, or maybe you'd kind of futz it, and then you would demonstrate the fact that, you were a sort of arriviste. Maybe you didn't belong in this, high society performing this ritual. And so the kind of work, the sort of anxiety around these objects were also part of their appeal, but also I would say kind of their frisson. You'll notice that the tabletop, and a lot of people, museum goers may not realize that this marquetry, a lot of 18th century French furnishings look like a kind of sea of different shades of brown and sort of dark green. But at the time, they were really, really brightly colored, sometimes painted or sometimes with the use of brightly colored woods. They were almost as bright as the detail of the sort of skirt that you see in the Boucher portrait. And you can see some of that color remaining, the green on the vase and the leaves and so on, but they've, that their sort of richness, the way that they popped and the way that they also, the palette was also very Rococo, is lost a bit today. But you can see that the representation of, flowers, images of sort of abundance, fertility, these scenes of kind of nature that speak to Pompadour's love of nature and of gardening, but, in a very kind of, I think they also speak to the sort of interplay of nature and artifice, which is a hallmark of the Rococo. But she was a big fan of, I think getting back to nature in an artful manner is maybe one way to put it. As well as of the pastoral genre, which she kind of lived and performed, not just on stage. And Mark will say a little bit about the pastoral genre and, in the sort of actual theater and in opera. But I just wanted to, I just have a few minutes left, and I just wanted to say a little bit about another arena in which she was a kind of performer. And that was through garden buildings and retreats that she built on the outskirts of royal palaces, as well as some of her own residences. She was a huge patron of architecture and of garden and landscape design. You can see her here, another portrait that represents her by the artist Carl van Loo as a kind of shepherdess. So she's also interested in sort of dressing up and playing with this kind of, cross-dressing masquerade in which a noblewoman masquerades as a shepherdess. Marie Antoinette does this several decades later, but Marie Antoinette had nothing on Madame de Pompadour. She started this, much earlier, and she really expanded it in a number of different sites. One of them, as you see on the bottom right, this is a plan of one of these garden retreats, these kind of quasi-rustic retreats that was built for her on the outskirts of the royal palace of Fontainebleau by the royal architect Jean-Jacques Gabriel. And you can see sort of beautiful laid out gardens, still in the formal French style. We're not quite at the irregular English garden that Marie Antoinette favored. But the house itself was, the sort of garden retreat was called a hermitage. And that might have been a kind of satirical, a bit of a joke. Hermitages were places, sort of traditionally where monks or other, religious individuals, mostly men, would kind of retreat for a site of sort of ascetic spiritual contemplation. And Pompadour would go there mostly to sort of entertain, the king or other intimates. And she wasn't so interested. I mean, she was religious, like pretty much everyone in, Catholic elite France in this period, but she also went there to pursue a kind of bodily rejuvenation, to engage in a sort of pastoral fantasy. But I think also these were kind of health retreats for her. And she was a big proponent of this new kind of revolutionary understanding of the relationship between the body and its environment in the 18th century, and especially the idea that, spending time outdoors in nature, surrounded by, flowers, trees, gardens, fresh air, sunlight, and natural foods, some of which were grown at these rural retreats, would be rejuvenating. She suffered from poor health throughout her life. And she took up this kind of neo-Hippocratic revival of medicine and practiced it and performed it at these retreats. And just to show you one last object that's associated with that, at the top, I didn't put in a label for it, but this is a Sèvres pink. The color is called Rose Pompadour. It was named after her by a craftsman at the Sèvres manufactory, and she was a big fan of this color. It's a Sèvres porcelain milk goblet. The French term is a gobelet à lait. And this was a new kind of prototype that the Sèvres porcelain manufactory, of which she was a huge fan and sort of patron of this factory. She was instrumental in making it a royal manufactory. They designed this prototype for elite women and some men like Pompadour who were engaging in this neo-Hippocratic health trend of drinking fresh milk. Prior to pasteurization and refrigerated railway cars, most most people, would consume dairy products in the form of butter and cheese, but this was a kind of health trend, harkened back to ancient writers like Hippocrates, hence the neo-Hippocratic trend. But it was something that she would do at her toilette. She would have these kinds of milk goblets, and she bought a number of them. I think she bought up every prototype that Sèvres produced for a period of about 1759 until she died in 64. And, they had this cover partly so that, if you're sitting at your toilet table, you don't have the powder from your wig kind of falling into the milk, and it would keep the milk sort of warm, and you would drink it, and then you would put it in this socketed saucer. Another name for these cups was called a trembleuse, because it was believed that people who needed the milk diet suffered from kind of poor health, which she actually did. But that also became a kind of health trend, a kind of fad in the period, that you were, naturally a little bit nervous, or, you needed milk to kind of stable your, to be returned to a state of stability when modern life all around you was making you a little, or maybe the performance of sociability was making you a little bit anxious. And so you'd be able to put your cup kind of securely in this saucer so that your nervous hands wouldn't kind of knock it over and shatter it. So I guess it's, it's sort of a utilitarian object as well as a very sort of luxurious demonstration of this trend. All right, I'm now going to turn it over to Mark to talk about Pompadour's theater, and then I think we can again, circle back to pick up on any of these themes.
Hi, thank you so much, Meredith. And I would like to circle back. I mean, almost immediately, you used this idea of her as a kind of multimedia artist and as a convener. And I think the sort of amazing, fairly short-lived experiment of the Théâtre des Petits Appartements, which we remember really only exist between 1747 and 1750 as a thing, really has a sort of wide resonance, and I think demonstrates perfectly some of the themes that you've been stressing on, because we remember that as a young woman in the tutelage of this very powerful financier family that really helped to make her the Tournaimes, she had a base at Étoile, which was her first kind of experiment in theatre and performance as a kind of political strategy. She almost rehearsed for the Théâtre des Petits Appartements as a very young woman. She was already extremely accomplished in both music and dance, but also apparently a prodigious memory for the lines of a drama. So the kind of extraordinary day in 1750 of which the Lafayette Opera plays a role is actually, only someone with the kind of gift for prodigious memory and ability to adapt across genres of music, drama, and dance could possibly have even taken that on. I think, many people from Adolphe Julien to Philippe Orcade more recently have pointed to the kind of extraordinary experiment that the Théâtre des Petits Appartements was. And remember, it's called that because the theatre was constructed in the north of the chateau at the Petite Galerie, near the sort of slightly more staid medal cabinet, but it's where the king's small appartements were, and that's how we know it as the Théâtre des Petits Appartements. But in fact, it sort of, in its second season, you'll probably remember, it busts out of there, and they created a sort of, for the 48-49 season. And remember, these seasons started in November and went on to February or March of the following year. So this was the kind of the time of that theatre. They got extremely ambitious, and in terms of scenery, design, and many other aspects. But I want to just point out that, in fact, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the whole enterprise was that first she was taking seriously and reviving a prodigious and a long-standing tradition of theatre at the court, one that involved performance, not just the performance of leisure as work, but the performance of a kind of royalty and kingship through what came to be known, which Alain Viala has so beautifully analysed as kind of gallantry, because this is, in fact, remember, the Journée Galante. I want to come to that in a minute. But what's so special about what Madame Pompadour did, only a couple of years into her ascendancy as the maîtresse en titre, was that she created rules for this theatre in which she would deliberately mix highborn, the highest born of actors and actresses, with extremely specialized and brilliant commoners, actresses drawn from the world of theatre and opera, but also, if you remember, so she's got courtiers like the Duc de Vallière, but she has Moncrief, she has Rebelle, she brings the actor and singer Gilliot in, not as a singer, but as a cellist. He plays the cello. They have, Louis-Auguste de Bourbon is on the bassoon, the Marquis de Sourches is on the viola, Mondonville and Lalande are leading the violins. We have this extraordinary mixture of sort of professional expertise and court theatre. And she decides that it will be the actresses and dancers who will set the rules for what gets performed. She creates a set of rules which sort of within the court structure allow her both space and her collaborators space and decision-making power. So you can really argue that the Théâtre des Petits Appartements was not just an experiment in wowing the king with extraordinary dramas and performances, but actually sort of creating the space of a certain kind of authority. And that's what makes the, as well as her amazing kind of accomplishment, the Théâtre des Petits Appartements such an interesting experiment. Short-lived and highly criticized, especially after the 48 to 9 season, which sort of had to do double duty because it was supposed to also roll into it the celebrations of the victories in the War of Austrian Succession and the slightly more dodgy peace of Aix-la-Chapelle. But I want to mention that among the various roles that she took, which could vary from the old 17th century and early 18th century classics like Acis and Galatea to perhaps unexpected things like the rambunctious sort of quasi-pastoral, the Amour de Ragonde, in which she played the trouser role of the poor Colin, who, despite being in love with Colette, played by her great friend and cousin Madame de Marchais and Salonière, she is forced by the trickery of various kinds to marry the less than fresh Ragonde. And therefore, of course, what ensues is a great charivari, which is, of course, rough music that celebrates an inappropriate marriage. But all of this, you can imagine this playing out, sometimes in front of the Queen and King, we come to that later, but in front of the court, the kind of joy in upturning certain, the turning over, the joy of a sort of almost a populist charivari in the middle of court, the joy of trouser rolls, the delight in seeing high-born male courtiers playing women in cross-dressing roles. All of this, I think, should alert us to the remarkable nature of this theatrical experiment. Now, and what Opéra Lafayette are producing is, of course, one part of one of the more remarkable, almost a swan song in the 1750, so 49 to 50 season of the Théâtre des Petits Appartements, which was called the Journée Galante. And just to remind us, it opened with a kind of sort of scene-setting toilette ballet, the Toilette de Vénus, which was essentially the creation of Lagarde and the choreographer, the very important man who we don't know that much about, Deye or Déesse. But it featured Madame de Pompadour with Marie-Louis de Caillebotte, the Marquis de la Salle, another of his favorite actors as Mars. Then she gave way to Madame de Marchais in the sort of next part of the day, who played the title role of Aiglé, again, opposite a duke. And then, and of course, that's the same Duc d'Aillon, in fact, who then becomes involved in all the famous electric. The next year, he becomes the sort of the convener of the great electric experiments, but that's another story. And then Madame de Pompadour comes back to play Hérault in the Lagarde and Logen's Léandre et Hérault, which, as you will remember, and as will unfurl before you as spectators of the opera, changes very much the tragic story of Léandre and Hérault into a gallant tale, where, of course, eventually the chorus sings the triumph of love, the old tragic ways are repaired and love continues forever. So in other words, Pompadour is explicitly taking part in a kind of revisionism of through a gallant lens, a lens of galanterie, which Viala described as kind of the art of love and the love of art, sort of in a way replacing what you might expect as a kind of a tragic a tragic moment with something highly celebratory. So before I finish, which I must in a few seconds and hand over for some questions, I want to, what then I think is, you know, the afterlife of this extraordinary spectacular culture. If we could just have the last, maybe I'll cut to the, maybe I will, because I just always speak too much, but maybe we could go to the second of these slides straight away, Meredith. I mean, there is a great and wonderful painting in the Met that I'm sure you'll all know, called La Toilette de Vénus, which was supposed to have been created in the light of or inspired by this very performance of La Journée Galante in 1750. But to me, it's created for a particular pavilion in the Château de Belleville, which was where the theatre had to go in after 1750, when the scandals around costs and dangers of Versailles ended up. But to me, something about this is not really some sort of legacy or theatrical image of, you know, Madame de Pompadour and role. It doesn't represent her, but it seems to represent something both of the extraordinary performative culture that existed of the Théâtre des Petits Appartements, but the profusion points to things that both Melissa and Meredith are talking about. You know, the mirror is practically bursting out in flower. The putti at on the back of the seat or sofa is almost sort of growing organically out. There's profusion here. There is something that most versions of La Toilette de Vénus, which I'm showing you a sort of a vouée from a century and a half before to compare, it absolutely preaches a kind of profusion and the kind of organic flow that both Meredith and Melissa were talking about. It celebrates the most delicate and gallant of Venuses, but it also points to the fact that, you know, in the whole, it is extremely mythologically correct in some sense, as the Venus that Dryden described as, you know, the center of every love, the force that creates love that everyone turns to. And in a way, I sort of feel it as a kind of it's a homage to the version of gallant control, authority, and love that Madame de Pompadour so exercised in the grand moment of the Théâtre des Petits Appartements. So, I mean, we can talk about some of its other features. This is a remarkable painting, as alive as the vouée is dead in some ways, as pastelly fantastic as the vouée is, you know, sort of over-restrainedly bright. But we can perhaps talk about that in the chat. But anyway, I think I should stop there. I don't know if Meredith or Melissa want to add anything.
We also have a number of questions in the, I mean, I'm assuming if we ask some of these questions, start with some of these questions, we can elicit further discussion between the three of you. Do you guys want to work backwards with your questions or forwards with your questions? This is the
as you wish, but should I stop the share so we can see each other and then we can come back to images if people want to revisit them?
Yeah, that sounds good. We had some questions coming in the Q&A, which we can start with, but I would encourage everyone to either unmute themselves if you want to ask it live, or you can continue to put questions in the Q&A. And I think we have so many things that we could draw upon in terms of the richness of these objects. Well, maybe we can start at the beginning. Melissa, actually, I would love to hear more about this question of makeup that Meredith asked you. If you wanted to sort of follow up just a little bit more about that image and sort of what's going on with the changing sort of cultures of performance of presentation that you were just sort of starting to intimate at the end of yours.
Well, it's a big question, and maybe I'll just take one part of it, which is that my interest in that painting grew out of research that I had done about, or had realized that one of the themes in criticism, in salon criticism, art criticism, was very much directed at the whole sort of culture, the love of artifice, and particularly when it came to Boucher, the metaphor of paint as makeup was evoked over and over again, and he was really described as, you know, having overly made up complexions in his treatment of female figures, whether they were at their toilette or not. And so part of my interest in the Pompadour painting was to think about the ways in which that painting evokes the kind of metaphor of painting itself, as a form of makeup. And so in some sense, it's a kind of self-referential image for Boucher as a kind of emblem of Rococo artistic practice, but it's also very much about Pompadour and, you know, some of the things that we know about her, you know, her delight in the toilette and the facts of the toilette. So it kind of operates on two levels, as an image of art making, of Rococo art making, and as an image of Pompadour's. You know, that would be a place to start. I don't know if you all would like to jump in on that. Does that speak to your question a bit?
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And there are these moments in the painting where, like when she's the brush, the makeup brush that she's holding in her hand, it has the rouge on the brush. So these sort of passages in the painting where Boucher's paint is contiguous with Pompadour's paint. You know, they are the same pigment. There are lots of other things to be said about this as well. I think it's a kind of metaphorical self-portrait as well for Pompadour. And there's been interesting new work done about it in terms of questions of race and how whiteness and cosmetics and the emphasis on rouge relate to a kind of construction of an ideal of whiteness that I think hasn't been work that I've been doing, but I think it's been really interesting new ways of thinking about that image in terms of cosmetics and the Rococo and makeup and things.
Yeah, that's another really important, a really interesting and important thread. And I mean, sort of builds on issues we were talking about last year with Opera Lafayette, thinking about the connections between French culture and, of course, what is happening in Saint-Domingue at the same time. This is an unrelated question, Meredith, but we also had like a small detail question in the chat that was asking about in the desk, the question of like when you were mentioning painting, that sort of took people by surprise in terms of color versus inlay. Could you just clarify what's going on sort of technically in the construction of that piece of furniture?
Well, marquetry is an inlay technique. Sorry, I didn't mean to suggest some of the wood itself, particularly some of the kind of boring European wood, might have been painted with quite, silver metallic paint, hot pink. I mean, again, this, the idea that the furniture looks this, kind of boring brown and that you have all this like porcelain kind of popping or these dresses, it was all popping, it was all super blinged out. And there's a furniture maker, a guy called Rococo, who does a kind of treatise on painting in wood. From the 18th century in the Wallace collection. I don't know if they did an exhibition or if they did a book about it. Do you remember, Mark and Melissa? But there was something that was related. Anyway, I can try to find, if anyone's interested, I could find the link to the treatise, but it sort of describes the kind of pigments that you would use, but also painting in wood could mean using the actual natural color of a particular wood, a kind of purple amaranth or, and sort of creating a kind of mosaic or a sort of multicolored design. But if the wood wasn't colorful enough, then they could add synthetic or pigments to it.
That's real. No, thank you so much for that clarification. It's super interesting. Also, certainly reminds me of like what was happening with harpsichord design at the same time, to think about our musical resonances in terms of gilded harpsichords, painted harpsichords, beautiful wood harpsichords. We had a couple of, oh no, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering, you've mentioned cross-dressing a number of times, and I was struck by the first time you mentioned it, that it's really cross-class dressing, not cross-sexual dressing, and that when she is portrayed, takes on a shepherdess's role, and yet later Mark is referring to taking on a man's role and men taking on women's roles and things. And I'm wondering, vis-a-vis color, as someone who deals in art history, how do colors mean different things in the 18th century than they do it to us today? And when did pink get associated with femininity? Is it with Pompadour? How does that play into how they're dressing, what they're thinking about the dress that they're wearing, and as that's going to be such an interesting issue in our own costuming, at least in EO. So I'm curious to what art historians say about that kind of thing.
Yeah, because I actually wanted to piggyback off on that is how did Pompadour pink get associated with Pompadour? Was it the makeup she was using? Was it color she was wearing? kind of going back with his question. I was wondering if you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, I think well, this is kind of a Melissa question, just because, I mean, the first thing to say is that pink was not specifically, it did later, later on become associated with women and femininity, but was not in the 18th century. And Melissa has a whole project on men in pink. And there's a sort of fairly recent publication put out by the Harvard Art Museums on kind of the color pink. But the question of Rose Pompadour, and was it her rouge that it was, Melissa? Do you want to pick up on that?
Well, you mean the name of the pigment for Sèvres, or just the association between
why Pompadour and pink, I guess?
Yeah, I mean well, it clearly was a color she liked, and I think there's some factual truth to that. We didn't show you, but there are other portraits of her. One in the Wallace collection where she's wearing this magnificent kind of pink. It sort of verges on salmon, but pink dress, where she's standing in a garden. The fog portrait, the one where she's at her toilette, that is a major kind of theme, chromatic theme in that image. But it is, so I think on the one hand, she embraced the color, and Boucher, it was a color that predominates in his palette, often in works that he produces for her. So there's some factual basis for it. And I mean, rouge tended to be more red than pink. I mean, it could be pink on the cheeks, but it was much more extreme in terms of what it looked like it wasn't supposed to look natural at all. It was supposed to be very bright red. So I don't think that the pink is so much a product of her use of rouge, but it becomes very much associated with the feminine and with all of the sort of cognate terms that go along with that, as the Rococo increasingly becomes identified as a feminine style. And pink being a really, not the only color in the Rococo palette, but certainly an important one. And that's one of the things that critics are pointing to constantly. And when they don't like something, they call it feminine, right? That's essentially. But in terms of, Ryan, your question, oh, Mark, jump in, please.
Look, I just want to say, I want to reinforce everything Melissa said. And also, let's point to the fact that, because of who Pompadour was, she had many enemies at court. She also had to play against an increasingly subtly manipulated public opinion. And when a whole series of critics started to turn on an entire courtly culture, because I want to remind everyone that 1748 is probably the high point of France's great military achievements. These people who were cross-dressing were also great military men or women, or there was no perceived sort of lack of manliness to cross-dressing or wearing pink or anything. But an entire public discourse started to evolve, which was explicitly an anti-court discourse, in which Pompadour really played the role of, straw woman, in which led to an aesthetic movement which decided that a return to some good old chiaroscuro, that Boucher's palette was kind of awfully like a sort of a makeup boutique, and that we needed to go back to sort of rectilinearity and good light and dark, and what we understand as the kind of the generation of the 60s and 70s who were taught to go back to sort of a retour à l'ordre, practically, of a kind of, and that has completely colored our attempt to understand the relationship between the dynamism of court culture and the color palette and the dress codes, etc., etc. So it gets a bad press from only 10 years after it it is produced and burgeons. I also wanted to say that, of course, I think Boucher contributed to to Pompadour's exorbitant love of pink, because I think his palette had already changed in the from the beginning of his career in the 1730s, and Boucher gets co-opted by, like all the musicians that she's so good on good friendly terms with, he is co-opted into her image because he's so wonderfully fluent at this new and interesting color palette. So I actually think that Boucher had a lot to do with Pompadour's adoption of pink. I think that, in fact, you could see that it isn't just her saying, could you do me something pink? He had already developed that vocabulary as part of his color vocabulary, as part of his attempt to differentiate himself from his forebears.
Mark, you should say something also about the expanded lexicon of terms or shades of pink that because Mark wrote an essay for the Fog volume that Meredith's talking about, where the explosion of trade in shells and sort of the availability. Well, I'm talking about you talk about your piece about pink. I think there's really
well, okay. All I would add,
big complicated question. We just say about pink in the 18th century. But yeah.
I basically think that pink was associated with artifice in a really bit of tricksy moral philosophizing, which of course all painting is artifice, as we know. If you put a three-dimensional world onto canvas, you have, but it's sort of truthiness that they're really getting at. It's kind of, it's not real artifice, or it's not artificial real, but artificial. But in fact, Boucher was a great lover of shells, and the shell lovers literature is full of descriptions of the pink insides of shells. So there's nothing unnatural about pink. Pink comes into the natural world in many ways, not just gardener's pink and rose pink and everything, but shell pink, which, I just pointed to the fact that there's a sort of manual of shell collecting that uses the word rose, hundreds of times to describe forms of. So in other words, we're not even dealing with an artificial color. We're not dealing with a feminine color. We're not dealing with an artificial color, and we're dealing with one whose fortunes have been shaped by, I don't want to call them the Brown Brigade, but I want to call them the chiaroscuro brigade, or in which soberness, sobriety, restraint, became moral qualities. If you think about Diderot championing Greuze and his sort of fantasies of perfect bourgeois and peasant life in the Salon, this is the kind of alternative that Diderot pitches. He's one of the sort of people that criticizes, and because Diderot is so fabulous and so important to the Enlightenment, we have rather taken his version of Pompadour as truth. And as Melissa will know better than anyone, it's a complicated story.
We had a couple of questions about actually the Cochin, moving from Boucher to Cochin. If you could talk a little bit about what sort of evidence we can learn about. We had questions about sort of, can you see the orchestra in that painting? Can we learn anything about performance tradition from that painting, was one question. And then another question related to that painting was this question of, well, what sort of history is there of this mixing of professionals, super high level professional and amateur performers in this period, or before this period? Yeah. Oh, you might be muted. You're muted, Mark.
I mean, I'm sure the others will want to chime in, but unfortunately, this is very scant and sadly almost the only evidence of the actual moment of these performances, and from which we can tell little except for some of the complexities of the, there were famously complex sets, including this amazing arrangement of candles that had to substitute as the sun at one point and set light to things. We don't really know. Why you can gain the evidence from is the print, the publications that came afterwards, which list who was playing what instrument, who was acting in what. It is far greater a mixture of explicit mixture of noble players and the great professional cadres than had ever been seen before. Remember, whole orchestras used to come to Versailles all the time, and we all know this from Le Roi Dance and Lully and all of that. But we don't have quite so much explicit sort of this new idea of the sort of the intimate performed friends theatre, which was growing up from the 1720s and 30s, and which has some sort of it has 17th century pedigree, but it essentially explodes with the Regency and after. That ethos is slightly different to the command performance in which the king is going to dance, which is I think kind of another of Pompadour's kind of innovations. I can't think of any other moment apart from this small one in which so many courtiers, nobles, even princes of various forms mixed so assiduously and repeatedly with kind of the very best professional class musicians and writers and artists as this moment. I mean,
it's probably worth mentioning too that the libretti of both of the operas that we'll be doing the De la Garde and the Io, are essentially metaphors for the divine and the mortal of getting together, or forbidden. Well, there are other things that Madame de Pompadour sang in, which where they are exactly that. You know, Zélande au roi des sylphes that we've done is the mortal and the god getting together. And so I think what you're saying in part is that it's playing out all throughout the theater, not just between Madame de Pompadour and not just a metaphor, Madame de Pompadour and Louis XV, but it's breaking up other boundaries that as well, and made okay by the metaphor and the libretto.
And I would also even argue that this performance, as Meredith and Melissa point out, performance is not superficial. You've got to understand that performance is part of the art of war, it's part of the art of diplomacy, it's part of the art of statecraft. It is kind of, so you think of the Maréchal de Saxe, the most successful of French military, or borrowed military men for the French armies in the War of Austrian Succession, taking his theatre troupe with him, and they are the ones that sing the end of the siege in Brussels and things. In other words, we should take very seriously the idea that performance, reperformance, mixing, that music drama has an enormous amount of sort of role to play in statecraft. And I think we at our peril do we think that this is sort of the amusements of, something the king had to do to pep up his libido or something. I feel like this is much more central to what it was. It's central to Madame de Pompadour's moment of centrality at the court.
And I think also, just to add a little bit to that about this particular image, I mean, it really shows the kind of, artful appreciation of nature, but it's also a scene from, Assis Égalité, and the kind of pervasive representation of, Ovidian stories from the Metamorphosis, and this kind of notion of transformation. You can understand how that would speak to, a woman of non-noble origins who had to constantly transform herself, and to a noble culture that I think, really understood the power of art, of performance, but also of objects that had a kind of agency and that could make you, move you a certain way, make you feel a certain way, make you do things. There's a kind of wonderful architectural treatise that's published around this time, the Petit Maison. I don't know if probably some people in this audience are aware of it. It's the story of a kind of marquis and a young ingenue, and he bets her that he can seduce her by taking her on a tour of his pleasure pavilion, his Petit Maison. And through the course of going through these, and really the protagonist is the house itself and these objects. And they ultimately, well, in the first version of the story, she doesn't fall for it and she kind of resists his advances. And apparently the people were very disappointed with that ending. And so the author changed the ending in the end so that the art won. But, this kind of power of transformation, I mean, that also speaks very much to Rameau and Io, another Ovidian story of metamorphosis. And I think that's also really key to kind of understanding the metality of the 18th century and of the Rococo, and the way that art kind of interacted, played a role. Well,
I think we're very nearly out of time, but just to follow up on that, could we have the pastoral for a second, Meredith? Just about the sort of whole question of fluidity of various kinds of identity and performance. Like within the context of the pictorial pastorals, one of the things that is very characteristic of Boucher's treatment of these subjects is the kind of ambiguity and fluidity in the way that the characters are gendered. And that also goes along with some of the cross-dressing. We didn't really have time to talk about that, but the sort of gender play that goes on in the theatrical performances. And these are actually, paintings that directly related to specific comic operas in which there were trouser roles. And anyway, I think that this delight in sort of pushing back against clear-cut and sort of categorical definitions of identity, whether it's gender identity or class identity, and it speaks again to the sort of performative aspects that of the culture that Meredith and Mark have been talking about. Those play out in visual terms in some of the pastorals like this, where very often Boucher would use the same model to depict male and female figures, so that they're really quite, the part of the point is to kind of delight in the ambiguities of those figures. So just wanted to throw that in as another thread as we think about the operas that are going to be performed.
This is all so fascinating. And fortunately, there are so many lingering threads, though also fortunately, I shall say, we have in 2 weeks' time, we have our speakers back with Machine Dazzle, the costume designer. So we are going to be able to continue talking about questions of art history. So I think at the moment, I'm going to adjourn our formal proceedings, but there were a couple of questions in the Q&A we didn't get to. So if anyone would like to stick around for another couple minutes, and make sure those questions get answered, I'd be very happy, I think, to hear more. This has been such a just wonderful evening, and I really thank very much our speakers, and we'll be looking forward to hearing more as we go on. And I don't know if no one leaves, we can just keep the Q&A.
I want to know, Mark, was she a good singer? Do we know?
Yeah, exactly.
She was a good, I mean, from what we understand, she not only could sing, you know, she was trained to sing in tune and sustain, but she learned roles fluently from beginning to end. I mean, if you look at the scores of the things she is being expected to sing, I mean, there really isn't a substitute. She's not singing necessarily with a choir or a sort of body double singer behind her trying to help her out. There was, remember, a trained choir of child dancers, mostly boys between the ages of 9 and 12, that acted and danced in roles, and then peasant roles and roles in chorus types were taken by other nobles and by professional singers. But she was often, you know, involved in long solo stretches, as far as we can tell from the scores and the livres that we've been left. And, you know, in order to do that, she had, I believe, she already had the confidence when she came in 1745-ish. She already had she knew she was good at singing and dancing and acting. Those were qualities she'd already built up. She didn't have to be specially tutored, though I think she had a lot of traffic, from what I understand, with some of the musicians and actors who kind of got to know her, rather like Boucher did. And they did seem to entertain cordial enough relations, as far as we can see. So she probably picked up a lot of hints from the professionals as far as like, where should I stand, or how am I going to project this, or whatever. But we must make no mistake, she was exceptionally good at acting, singing, and dancing, as far as we understand. I mean, you know, it's hard, so hard, because so many memoirs of Madame Pompadour are in fact false, or you know, so many intimate accounts of her turn out to have been written, you know, years later, or completely made up. But what we can tell does seem to point to a very much greater than average level of competence in singing, dancing, and musical.
Yeah,
I would
I
love
think
to hear
Callum.
Yeah, what Callum has to say about the question of her voice. And I'm sorry I missed the earlier discussion of this, but yeah.
I think Callum might have also talked a little bit of it in his essay. Oh, there he is. Yeah.
Oh no, I would agree with everything Mark said. I mean, you can see from the scores just how carefully these operas were written for her. I mean, they're so perfectly composed for this particular singer. And yeah, I mean, she was trained from such a young age as a performer, like so many of these you know, worldly enlightenment women. And you see in these scores these really interesting markings. I talked about them a few months ago. These markings that are kind of unique to her voice. These markings, especially in the ones at Rebel and Francoeur, who were the directors of the Paris Opera, they had these specific markings that were unique to things that they wrote for Madame de Pompadour. These kind of breath marks, these marks to tell her where to breathe, where she tended to go flat, where she tended to kind of go off pitch. So she was. I mean, she had certain vocal difficulties that came from her. She was very ill most of her life, and it's well documented that she had kind of coughs and wheezes and certain things that made singing very difficult for her. and this is, you see it in her letters and in people's writings about these performances. And interestingly, there was one time where she did have a double stand in for her. At least I think that's the Duc de Luynes in one of his memoirs. There's an account of one of his performances, but there was only, I think there was one time when she had a really bad cough. But most of the time people are really, I mean, it's hard to know how much to trust a lot of these sources, because they can be kind of kind of fluffed up a little bit. But
I thought one of the interesting things that you had pointed out before, Callum, was that because people tended to write simpler airs for her to make sure that she would sing them well, that it actually contributed to a stylistic change in music towards so-called classicism and sometimes less ornate lines. That was, I thought, really interesting point about generally stylistic, where she sat in the 18th century stylistically and what it meant.
Yeah, I think David Charlton calls them song operas. That's right. Operas that were written for her because they're so melodic and I think she really suited these kind of simple melodic lines. And you can see if you compare, say, her, the kind of melodies written for her compared to some of the melodies say from Acis Égalité, it's a lot simpler, and it makes use of her voice. You can tell it's making use of her voice in a way that's much more kind of easy and kind of breezy and lighter and less kind of showy, but allowing her to really make use of what she has, I think. Which is really interesting.
I was going to say, Callum, like one thing I really liked when you talked about in our November Salon series was how modern day singers, if they feel like that piece they really resonate with, they can sing it well. We kind of get an idea of like what her voice might have sounded like. I was wondering, that was the talk, right? Because you kind of mentioned, okay. So that's how we can kind of maybe see a little bit of what she would have sounded like, with seeing how artists today can represent her music, and if they have a real connection of like, this is written for me too. So that's really a great kind of comparison as well.
And I think we should remember too about dance. I would love to know more about DS or DA, who seem to have a special role, not only in the pieces of the Journée Galante, but also throughout, because it strikes me that the same might be true for a kind of choreographer who might need to be in great sympathy, because not everyone can dance everywhere in exactly the kind of way that might be appropriate to every form. And so I'd be really interested to hear more about like the mise en scène that he allowed, or in general. So I can see Callum has his hand up. So.
If I'm not mistaken, I think De Hesse was the choreographer for the Comédie Italienne. I'm right about that, I think. Which I think was really interesting because it speaks to this kind of generic mixture that Madame de Pompadour brought into the Théâtre des Petits Cabinets. That she brought this choreographer. I mean, if you look at the things that he worked on at the Comédie Italienne, he's working with people like Favart, Sedan, etc. And she's bringing him in to work on these, bigger opéra-ballets and so on, and these bigger kind of pastoral works. He's sometimes written as d'essai. I've seen him in the Registre.
We'll get more of that in our third session this month with Rebecca Harris-Warwick and Hetty Law.
Yeah, and there are actually some dances that are written by Dessay that are available on the web. So it is possible to study his choreography. And there are different styles of dance. So obviously for Pompadour, one would be able to take a more graceful style, which might be simpler in execution technically, but more challenging in terms of having beauty.
No, that's.
But as you say, Ryan,
And,
but-
for, and for those of you who don't
We'll
know,
get
this
there.
is Catherine Tarosi, who's one of our choreographers in the upcoming performance of De Lagarde's Léandre et Héron.
I would like to add to the mix of things that Madame de Pompadour did, her important role in bringing Le Théâtre de la Foire into combining the best of the Théâtre de la Foire with the Comédie Italienne and creating what later on will be called the official opera-comique. Here too, she mixed a genre that was considered plebeian with a sponsored Comédie Italienne, a kingly sponsored Comédie Italienne into a new genre. So there too, she mixed things.
I think that, I mean, a lot of the great credit for some of that mixture is owed to a few years before, you know, the experiments of Favart and Co, and indeed, which of course turned out to involve Boucher and others. You know, they had already begun to think in the early 1740s, what are we going to do to create this kind of strange hybrid? And the pastoral became one of their main sort of, like, it's very moving to look at Favart's you know, manuscript of what became Les Vendanges de Campé, but was actually just called a Vendange from 1743, where you just see music and some dance outlines, and that starts to encapsulate, and on that is built a kind of an entirely new fusion, and as you say, a fusion that does, whether we like it or not, take from popular culture many of the elements of its essential energy, and yet present it in the most courtly fashion that it's possibly to exist. So yes, I agree. But I don't think Pompadour particularly invented it, but she must have been aware of it in the early 1740s before she came to the position she came to at court. And I think she brought that tradition with her.
Yeah, very good point.
I was struck when Meredith's talking about the new relationship of performers and nature, and feeling that nature, in addition, not just household items, can be alive and responsive, but certainly in the libretto of Io, of Rameau's Io, there's a very interesting section where Apollo, who is disguised, says, "Oh, because Io is rejecting his love, all of nature is turning gray, and the sun won't shine, and nothing's growing." And then she gives this funny line to him. She says, "Oh yeah, lovers always feel that everything around them is you know, the same as they are, or being affected by their love." And so there's this very, very, very conscious relationship of, oh, is nature, you know, responding to human feeling, or is human feeling responding to nature? And that's kind of an explicit and funny bit in Rameau's Io.
You know, that's really wonderful. I mean, you know, I think like the particular type of nature that they were interested in, on the one hand, you know, the pastoral genre, which is not necessarily always so natural, or it has a kind of natural outward surface, but, you know, inside there are these kind of very sort of art coded messages that are aimed at the elite. And, you know, that's, you know, Mark made that point that, you know, we've kind of lost, and especially once the Rococo and this kind of elite culture gets sort of opened up to the, you know, the sort of court of public opinion, you know, a lot of the sort of philosophical underpinnings, these sorts of ideas about sort of the seriousness of leisure and pleasure, you know, get lost to us. But I think that's also true of the kind of pastoral performance, which was a very serious mode of kind of social and political and cultural expression. And, you know, going back to, for royal women, going back to Catherine de Medici, you know, especially women who were kind of foreign born, or who maybe had to kind of arrive at their role and who wanted to perform their kind of natural, you know, their connection to nature, but also to the natural right of rule. You know, the pastoral is connected to a kind of virtue. Later on with Rousseau, it gets associated with a certain mode of, you know, domesticity. And so these, these women are very interested in this particular type of a kind of natural association or performance. And then with Pompadour, it's also these new ideas of nature and the kind of transformative sort of interactive idea of the body and the self, and how when you're in these kind of natural environments, they can transform you. And I love the idea that you can also act on them in turn, and turn a verdant meadow into a kind of gray, sad landscape. But Marie Antoinette is also thought about as having, the one who had the first kind of pleasure dairy as this sort of aberrant phenomenon where she was this frivolous queen who had milkmaids, produce milk for her. And that was also a tradition that goes back to Catherine de Medici and certainly to Madame de Pompadour. But I'm thinking of a quote of an American statesman who goes to visit the Rameau. He's part of this kind of new court of, public opinion, or, a sort of new critical take on this mode of performance in the 1780s. And he says of Marie Antoinette's kind of pastoral farm, he said, a dairy outfitted with the porcelain of Sèvres is a semblance too splendid of rural life. So there's this kind of fundamental disconnect here between, and maybe that's true, but it's also, we have all of this kind of overlay. And so I think this kind of stereotypical idea of the Rococo is very much filtered through some of this, the public sphere, and some of this criticism that was operative at the time.
Mark, you're muted.
I thought, Meredith, that you might mention, your amazing work on the Ballet de Porcelaine, and because this idea that objects are somehow both coloured by and come to life because of the sort of, some sort of divine power. I was so taken with what Ryan just said, because it's almost like a version of the pathetic fallacy, only for the Rococo, where your feeling, your effusion, your love granting power can sort of infect all the objects around you, instead of your woe being reflected in the darkness of the forest or whatever in a romantic poem. Because that's a sophisticated idea that's almost Lucretian. The idea of the whole of creation bending to Venus's charms or whatever, or it goes back to some of the deepest roots of pastoral or love literature as a kind of, and I don't think that's, again, it's nothing unserious. It's a deep, and Favart had a library of about, I think it was sort of 100 and something works, many of which were the deep history of pastoral. He knew his Virgil, he knew his Theocritus, he knew, so in other words, this is a conscious playing out of complex languages of pastoral, okay, in fairly jocular, fun, and some might say, it's not the eclogues, it's dress up. But actually, I think some of pastoral's ability of the constant change, and then the worry about oneself in the environment and the reflection of where one is in environment, I think that plays out even in the pastorals of Boucher from the 1740s and in the pastoral play of the court. So I'm trying to plead for us to take this kind of thing more seriously. And I think, I'm appreciative of the choir in Meredith and Melissa.
I think that metaphor of fluidity, we were talked a lot about pink, but I thought if we extrapolate, we talked about pastels and the fluidity of one color into another, and that is as opposed to the bold colors that you showed in the Vouet. Then we're really talking about a certain fluidity of ideas that itself color is a metaphor for in Rococo art.
And generative maximalism, which we might get to next in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I'm hiding out of my office because I didn't want my kids to Zoom bomb this chat, but I've now got to run home for the babysitter. Okay. But yeah, you did bring up the Ballet de Porcelaine, and I thought maybe that's something we can briefly touch on in our next series on, the neo-Rococo and how you can sort of mobilize this deep, rich history and sort of, make it relevant for contemporary audiences, which is what I imagine Machine Dazzle is doing with the Rameau production, and I can't wait to learn more about it. But everyone else can stay on. I'm just going to.
No, it's a good wrap-up point anyway, Meredith. Thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to next week and the week after to be
continued.
Mark.
Thanks, Meredith.
Sure,
thanks, Melissa.
Sure.
Oh, bye.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you, everyone.
Of course. To be continued. I mean, there's so much to do.
Yes. And be sure to join us on the 15th and 29th for this complete series. That will be a lot of fun.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jace. Thanks, everybody.
Bye,
Patty.